Okay, let's go ahead and kick off. We have people joining as we speak, which is a good thing. We welcome everyone into our webinar session today. My name is Jennifer Ray. I am with Aparo, and I look after training components of our services like webinars such as this and training events and IT coaching. So today, Aparo is hosting this webinar to share information with you guys surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. As you guys know, that's a hot topic in today's times as we're trying to navigate through this process. And we've been really fortunate to have Keith Wheeler from HR Resources of the Carolinas join us again to share his expertise on this subject. If you've joined us before, you may recall Keith has been very generous with his time and has shared with us early in this whole COVID crazy time sort of some information surrounding HR practices and topics that are of interest. So what we'll do today is, in a moment, I'll turn the conversation over to Keith, and he'll lead us through this subject relative to what we know as of today. As always, please feel free to put a question in chat or shoot over an email if you would like for something after the fact. If you'd like to engage in some dialogue here, we would love that. Certainly open the floor to questions and clarifications. Also, when we finish today, as is our practice, generally speaking, we'll follow along with a copy of this deck and any other resources that we may touch on today. We'll make sure that you have access to that information after the fact. With that, let me welcome Keith once again. Thank you so much for generous offering of your time and expertise. We always appreciate your perspective on matters surrounding HR. And with that, welcome.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. And thank you for that introduction. And I'm honored to be here again, hopefully to share some information with everyone today. And so good afternoon. Thanks for joining today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccinations and Company Policies. We're going to sort of talk about what do we need to consider. And I don't know about you, we've talked about this topic, but I can surely say that during this past year, my head spins even at the mention of COVID-19. It seems every day we're hearing about some new or different aspect of the virus that causes us to rethink how it's going to impact us individually, our organizations, and also our employees. So from the various state mandates to the rollout of vaccines, which we're talking about here today, and as you mentioned, Jennifer, there are a ton of information out there recently, especially on the vaccine. I was on another webinar just this morning. It was more about talking about the background of the vaccine, the effectiveness, and the variations and things of that nature. It really wasn't talking about policies or things that we need to consider, but it's important. So hopefully within this hour that we're together, the information shared here can help you or your organization when you're thinking about how to move forward with the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, for some of you, the information may be new, and I hope maybe you take away one or two things from today's presentation that you find helpful. And for others, it may just be a good reminder of things we should consider during the pandemic. Now, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box, and Jennifer will do her best to keep me informed if I need to stop and answer something. But we'll also save time at the end of today's presentation to sort of field questions or have discussion in more detail if need be. Now, and while I might not have the answer to your question, or if we're not able to get to your question, just know we'll be happy to follow up with you after today's webinar. So we'll get some information back to you. Now, as a matter of housekeeping, I also got to say, it's important to note a couple of key disclaimers. And, Jennifer even referenced this at the beginning. The information is changing so rapidly that every day there's something new. So the information I'm presenting here today is really only as current as the information I was able to access. And as we all know, it's changing. So also with today's presentation and information, remember, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a CPA, so this is not to be considered in any way legal or tax advice. I would also encourage you to make sure you review any specific steps or situations that you might be dealing with in your organization directly with your outside legal counsel, or even if you have outside HR support and resources that you can lean on. I think what I'm saying here is the bottom line. You have support, you have partners, take a partner in dealing with this. All right, so there's my housekeeping out of the way. So here's what I want to touch base on today as we go through the next half hour to 45 minutes. First, addressing the question, can you require employees return to work? Can you require they wear a mask? Can you require they be vaccinated? But we're also going to touch on, can you be liable for harm to an employee that comes about due to requiring vaccinations or returning to work? And what about your potential discrimination claims? There are things that you'll want to consider and we'll talk about during today. And lastly, I want to touch on some policy considerations and how that might, impact your decisions in moving forward. Now, given our limited time today for the webinar, the information is going to be more at a high-level overview to help provide those key points you may want to consider. And while I don't profess to be an expert in COVID-19, I can be available afterwards should you wish to discuss any of the topics presented here today in greater detail. All right, so let's start with a couple of the basic questions that even after a year in this pandemic still seem to come up. First, can you require your employees to physically return to the office or work location? This is the answer you're going to hear on several slides. Basically, the answer is yes, but. All right, so it's always yes, but. You should be asking them first, is it the right thing to do for you, your organizations, for your individuals, your employees? Before moving in that direction, I think it's important that you evaluate whether or not this is something that is necessary and what we consider a business necessity. Is it based on an objective review of your organization? Does the work require that employees report to a particular work site, or is it more of a preference or convenience for you and the organization? Now, we're going to touch base on business necessity again a little later in the presentation. Second, for employees that are working remotely or telecommuting, as some of us like to consider it, do you have a documented telecommuting policy or even a remote worker agreement in place with your employees? What are the things you should consider when we're laying out this type of document? Well, consider things like the expectations regarding time reporting. How do they report their time working? What do you expect of them and their availability during normal working hours? What about expected response times? How do you handle unexpected interruptions or absences? And maybe even consider video participation protocol for employees. Do they have the right kind of background setting? Do you have somebody that's broadcasting from their bedroom at home or from some other, from the bar down the street or whatever, if you might say? I think that's something we have to consider is, what do you expect to be the right professional setting and background? Another thing is you might even consider training your employees who might not be completely comfortable engaging virtually. I mean, how many times have we laughed about the phrase, hey, you're on mute, by the way? So, as we're trying to talk, teach your employees how to engage virtually in the new world that we're in. Third, if you do require employees to report to work, you got to think through, has the worksite been through the proper deep cleaning and what protocols are in place to keep your employees safe on an ongoing basis? And for that, we mean things like, I think about my son who's a middle school teacher for a charter school in North Charlotte, and they're on the AB schedule. And so they're very committed to, on Monday, Tuesday, group A comes in, Wednesday, everybody's virtual. So the facility goes through a deep clean, and then group B comes in on Thursday, Friday, and they have another deep clean over the weekend. So as they're rotating, they're committed to making sure they're doing what they can to keep the facilities as safe as possible. Now, and what about any reasonable accommodations? Think about that. If you're requiring your employees to return to the work site, are you prepared to deal with those who might not be able to return for a variety of reasons? And while most of us on this webinar today are HR professionals, know how to handle these type of requests, the interesting thing to keep in mind is that they're probably not always going to come to you. They're going to initially be brought to the managers or supervisors. So one of the considerations we want to make sure is, have you provided guidance and training on how these managers and supervisors should recognize when an employee may be seeking or need a reasonable accommodation request? And not only telecommuting policies, as I'm going to touch on policies throughout the presentation, you may also need to consider how the organization handles the current pandemic's impact on other policies and procedures. And these are things like, how are you handling performance reviews this year? How are you engaging your employees in compliance-related training, whether it's your anti-harassment training, additional supervisor training, maybe it's your diversity and inclusion training that you're going through. How are you engaging and keeping this going? It could also include things like recruiting, onboarding, regular staff meetings with employees, and what about separations? The things that we sort of taken for granted that have been in place in the past now need to be reevaluated in our new virtual environment. Now, one approach I might recommend is to create sort of a matrix of all your policies and procedures and have a checklist beside it that identifies what are those policies that are being impacted by a remote workforce. What do you need to revisit? So there's an example of one step you can take. Another question that continues to come up is, can you require employees to wear a mask? Again, a year later, we're still asking this question. Technically, yes, but if you do, there's some things you may want to consider. Number one, do you have a policy in place? If you're going to require masks be worn, are you going to provide the mask? If so, how many are you going to provide? How often are you going to provide them? What styles and options? And when I say what styles and options, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you on the webinar today might have heard, there was a lawsuit filed in California against Nike stores by individuals who were hearing impaired. And the point was that by wearing a mask, these individuals were not able to communicate with others because they could not read lips. The masks were covering the mouth, and so they were unable to read lips. So I'm going to be the first to admit that when this whole thing rolled out a year ago and we started requiring masks, I wasn't even thinking about wearing a clear mask so that people could be able to communicate. And that, again, could be considered a reasonable accommodation for somebody or for your situation. So again, we got to think about how we're doing that. I have another client that provides every employee, you go through the protocol of checking in if you're coming into the office, have you all the questions you ask about exposure to others with COVID-19 or experiencing any symptoms. But they go through the question, they know you're coming in, they have a little kit provided for you for the week. Here's a number of masks you have for the week, here's a little bottle of hand sanitizer, and here's the protocols that are in place that you're required to follow. So what are you doing if you're requiring them to be back into place to ensure that their employees are safe? And also, how many times have you taken the opportunity to engage and educate employees on how to wear their mask? How many times do we see people wearing masks that are under their nose or even just on their chin? Again, not properly fitted and not being effective. So, and this is different than what we're talking about, typical PPE, the personal protection equipment that may need to be issued depending on your organization or environment, but educating people on what it means to wear a mask. Now, if you are not going to provide masks, what is your guidelines you have in place around personal masks? And when I say that, think about this. What is the branding? You're allowed the people to come in and wear a branded face mask. What about social messaging on their mask? What about potential emblems that could be viewed as offensive to others? What you need to think about when you're talking about wearing masks in public, yes, we require you to wear a mask, but we also have some guidelines around what would be professional and appropriate in the work environment. So it's important to consider how you're handling that. You want to make sure it's in line with your anti-harassment policy. You also want to make sure it's in line with your, maybe dress code policies that you have in place for appropriate attire in the workplace. You want to make sure that nothing is deemed offensive is exposed to your employees. So again, additional points that we want to consider when talking about requiring masks. Okay, so I've touched on a couple of the general questions that, as I mentioned, still seem to be asked on a regular basis today, a year later. I want to transition to the key question around today's webinar about vaccinations. Now, we continue to hear about the coming access to vaccines and the importance of getting as many people as possible vaccinated, but what does it mean to your organization and your employees? Have you thought through, will your organization require employees be vaccinated before returning to work, or just going to encourage them to do that? And do you even know how your employees feel about getting vaccinated? Now, on the one hand, this is, we're getting ahead of this and being proactive, because right now, vaccines are not generally available to the population. There are certain groups of individuals that are accessible to be vaccinated at this point in time, but eventually, as we move forward and becomes more readily available, how will your organization address that? All right, so there are several different recent surveys that have come about that address this topic, and one of them I'm going to mention before we talk about the slide. For those of you who are familiar with the law firm Littler, they've published just recently their Littler COVID-19 Vaccine Employer Survey Report. That's a mouthful. In the Littler survey, it also noted that almost half the respondents, 48%, stated they would not mandate the vaccine for their employees. And the biggest reason ranged from resistance from employees, which was almost 80%, to the potential liability that they could have. That was almost over two-thirds of the participants. Now, on a separate note, talking about those who are mandating it, it is currently less than 10% of employees who are even considering mandating the vaccination. So it's a very small population. I think what you'll see is most are going to lean towards encouraging the vaccination. Now, also just last week, to kind of reference the slide you're seeing here, the Society for Human Resource Management of SHRM shared some findings from their recent survey. Some of the key findings regarding getting vaccinated are referenced here today throughout the presentation, including this slide about the potential rift and split between employees when considering COVID-19 vaccinations. As you can see, the survey indicated that around a third of the employees, 33%, believe that a COVID-19 vaccination should be mandatory. But on the other hand, you had almost a third, 28%, that said they wouldn't get vaccinated even if it meant the risk of losing their job. Now, that's a widespread difference. And so you really got to figure out what's going on here and what should we do and how should we approach this. When you break down this survey a little further, we looked at what are the reasons some employees say they won't get vaccinated. Well, the top 3 reasons shared here in the survey show a concern for possible side effects, a desire to wait and see if it's even safe. They want to see how it affects other people, and the feeling they don't even trust the vaccine at this time. This slide also contains a number of other reasons to be aware of why employees hesitate on getting vaccinated. So you can sort of prepare for your response and how you're going to deal with the employees. Okay, so the big question employees are grappling with right now is whether or not they're going to require their employees to be vaccinated in order to return to work or even travel on business, if you will. So the question becomes, can an employer require it? Guess what? The answer is technically yes, but before making any decision, I think it's important that you consider some additional key points. First, I think that one of the most important factors is to make sure any decision you make is based on facts and not on fear. And this fear can come from personal bias or, again, those personal biases that how you personally feel about the use of vaccines in the workplace. What I would strongly suggest is that you stay up to date on the latest information out of the CDC, Center for Disease Control, OSHA, and even the EEOC. Now, I'll reference this again, but later at the end of the presentation, there's going to be some links to these sites that have some additional information that can help you stay up to date. Another consideration is if a vaccine requirement is even needed, is it based on business necessity? And this is, again, an expanded definition of business necessity being a legitimate business purpose that justifies the employment decision as effective and needed to optimally achieve the organization's goals and ensure the operations run safely and efficiently. What's interesting about this definition and what's interesting about business necessity is that it cannot be established just by a mere articulation of reasons. So you just can't say, well, here's why we want to do it A, B, and C. What you want to do is show that you've gone through the proper type of assessment, you've documented your decisions and how it supports your organization and being able to fulfill your goals and objectives to the organization. All right, so depending on how you approach the decision of whether or not to require employees get vaccinated, it's also important to take time to think through the message you're sending your employees, and especially if there's consequences for not complying. SHRM just released a newsletter this morning that talked about mandating the policies. And you've really got to decide, if you put in a mandate, where's the line in the sand? What are you willing to do? And what are the consequences if the employee doesn't comply? Will they be terminated? Will they be excluded from the workforce? What are you going to do? And depending on how you communicate this and how you roll this out, it can make employees feel like they're unimportant or they're disposable. If you really don't care how they feel about it and how they're going to respond to it, you make them seem like, fine, you don't want to do it, you're fired, go find another job, or you're terminated, or you quit, whatever. You know, what you want to do is try and be as transparent with your open communication with your employees, because that can be valuable in the success of how a requirement or even encouragement is put into place. And if there is a decision to mandate the vaccine, you got to think through now, what will the company do to support this requirement? Consider things like, how will it be administered? Are you going to have on-site distribution of the vaccine? Is it going to be by you? Maybe you're large enough to have a wellness clinic or an on-site clinic, or maybe you're going to contract with a third party, or maybe you're going to leave it to the employee to seek out where and how they get vaccinated. They just have to come back and prove to you that they've been vaccinated. So if requiring the vaccination, think about, will you provide it on site? Will you also pay for, or will you pay for it up front? Or are you going to provide reimbursements to employees? Or what about incentives? Have you thought that through? Now, there's a lot of buzz around today, providing incentives instead of not mandating employees. They want to encourage them. So I'll encourage you by providing some type of incentive. And it could be as simple as cash for time off, or cash for getting your vaccine. It could also be some additional time off. It could be some other type of prizes. But be careful, there are tax implications of providing cash incentives or providing something like a gift of value that the IRS would consider more than de minimis in value. The other thing you want to consider is, if you're requiring, mandating employees be vaccinated, is that recordable time work? So do you need to pay them while they're getting their vaccinations? So in certain states, certain things are mandated. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand and how you're going to handle your employees should you mandate that they're going to be, that they are to be vaccinated. So, going back to, if you remember that 28% of employees in the SHRM survey who said they would not get vaccinated, well, here's a look at what type of incentives would sway them potentially to get vaccinated. And again, it's only 25% of those individuals could be swayed to get vaccinated. If you look at this, they might be motivated by a cash bonus or additional time off. But again, that's only 25% of the third that had totally said they would not get vaccinated. But ultimately, according to the survey, what you're going to see is that 70% of employees basically said no amount of incentive would convince them to get vaccinated. So that's an important message you're hearing here in this survey. So how do your employees feel about that? One of the biggest questions a lot of employers have around COVID-19 and mandating policy is, what liabilities does the organization take on in the area of discrimination and harm? Well, are you liable? Of course, the answer is yes. The organization can be held liable for discrimination or harm that comes to an employee as a result of a vaccine mandate. But there are things you should think about that can help reduce that potential liability. But before we even go into that, the first question to ask yourself is your organization at the threshold number of employees to be covered by the EEO or the ADA or the ADEA issue? So again, under age discrimination. So if you have 15 or more employees, you're basically going to be covered under the EEOC, you're going to be covered under the ADA. And if you have 20 or more employees, you're going to be covered under the Age Discrimination Act also. So if these do apply to your organization, consider how your new mandate or procedures are going to result as a result of the pandemic may be impacted. And again, because this impact can be different for each individual, the need for reasonable accommodations is probably going to be more visible now than ever. And as I mentioned earlier, while we understand how to deal with reasonable accommodation requests, make sure your managers and supervisors are aware, and also educate them on the process and procedures they should follow in asking for this request. All right, so what about harm? If the your employees, if you mandate the vaccine, can you be liable? Yes, but if it's mandated in part of a work environment requirement, then it's most probably going to be covered under your workers' compensation program. Of course, I'm going to suggest that you check with your carrier to be sure how to handle any potential claims that may come forward if you mandate the claim and they have an adverse reaction. And again, remember, according to the CDC and everything we know up to this point, the likelihood of an adverse reaction to the vaccine is considered very low. But just in case, it's best to be prepared on how to handle it. And this goes back to the value of educating your employees on the COVID-19 vaccines. And again, that's another thing you're going to hear. How do you continue to educate your employees? Share, you can over-communicate, make sure they're aware of all the information because you don't know where they're receiving their input and their data. Now, if you're going to merely encourage employees to get vaccinated, any potential adverse action an employee experiences most likely would not be covered under workers' compensation. And that is unless it's administered by you as the employer. This could even come into play if you contract, I mentioned earlier about a third party administering the vaccine for your employees. The idea here is that it's really the contractor becomes an extension of you as the employer. So it could be. Now, I would recommend not getting involved in administering the vaccine as that comes with added burdens and responsibilities. And we sort of talked about it, touched on a little bit. When we talk about medical records, we talk about ADA, things that we would not otherwise be exposed to. So you're going to have certain responsibilities to record keeping, record retention. You're going to have certain responsibilities to privacy issues. And again, as I said, it exposes you to potential medical records that you may not otherwise have been exposed to, but for the administration of a COVID-19 vaccine. And also don't forget about OSHA records and requirements. If it has to do, it creates a medical record on your employee, there's a longer term retention that you're going to have to consider in that case. So whether you decide or encourage employees to be vaccinated, you should consider how this approach or policy is going to impact other practices and policies within your organization. And for example, I sort of touched on already, your telecommuting policy. Again, you should set certain metrics and expectations for employees now that you're working remotely. And it could be as simple as how long is that going to last? Are we into it for the next year, to the foreseeable future? Or are we going to require employees return to the office at a certain time? Now, I know one organization that I'm familiar with has given their employees 90-day notice that they're going to be returning to the office. And part of that is saying that you have 90 days to get your affairs in order so that you can return to the office because the job's here now. And so as they're going forward with that, they're making arrangements to work with employees who might be stressed by that. So again, also the anti-discrimination policy, the thing I thought about as an example in this is, if you mandate the policy right now, only individuals who, other than first responders and those who are carved out, now teachers, if in fact, they're only available to 65 and older, or they're only available to people who have, additional health concerns that require the vaccination. So again, this exposes you to some additional potential discrimination issues if you're forcing these individuals and not others to get vaccinated. So it's just something you want to think about. And again, your leave policies. As we know, the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act is coming to an end at the end of March 31st. It actually ended December 31st, but employers were allowed to extend this through March 31st and take the payroll tax credit if the individuals had not received any of the emergency paid sick leave entitlement that they were entitled to. And again, this could change. It could get extended again. So just stay tuned and see how we go with that. All right. So when dealing with a decision on how to respond to the current pandemic, the availability of a vaccine and the need and our fears of your employees, I think it's also important that you don't take this particular situation lightly. And what do I mean by that? As a matter of fact, your leaders need to be responsive to what's going on, and they set the example. Your employees are watching your leaders and how they act and how they respond. Are they getting vaccinated? Are they working in the office and returning? How concerned are they for their employees and addressing the issue, whether they're required to return or whether they're required to get the vaccination? And just know, are they walking the talk, or or is it all lip service? And employees are quick to pick up on that. So there has to be a very valid reason. And as a group, a leadership group, they should be united and consistent in the messages being sent to the organizations. That's all based upon the right business decisions. Another great point to remember is taking time to educate your employees on the vaccines. There's different vaccines that are out there. There's new ones coming on the market, coming to us every day, including the new one, Johnson & Johnson, is getting ready to hopefully release and get approved. If you haven't done so yet, and I've said this earlier in the presentation, visit the CDC website, explore the various resources. And also, one of the things, and this is not a plug for any one particular benefits broker or not, but in doing my research, I came across a vaccine checklist that was generated by Gallagher that was very helpful. And what it made me think about is that whether you're, whoever your broker is, probably has access to a number of different resources that are available to you to share with your employees and also to help you make the right business decisions. So whether your broker is USI or whether it's some other independent benefits broker, I would encourage you to involve them in getting as much information available that can help you communicate with your employees. But no matter which direction you decide to go, I'm going to strongly encourage that you take a partner again. Go with your outside legal and let them know what you're looking at, what you're doing. Have somebody else review your policies, even review your communications to your employees so that before you make a decision to mandate employees be vaccinated, another approach you can take, and as we've seen in the earlier survey data, why not survey your own employees? Have you thought about that? Consider surveying what they know about the vaccine, what they know about the virus, how they feel about being vaccinated. And what would you do with this information? Well, it can be beneficial in knowing what kind of employee relations issues you might face if you decide to mandate the vaccination. And it could even be a survey about returning to the office. So you want to make sure that you understand the feelings of your employees and how you can best approach and respond to their concerns, both doing the right thing for the organization and also for your employees. All right, so as I said, it's going to be a rather quick half hour or so. In dealing with this, I just want to recap the key points and whether or not you're going to make a decision to mandate. And there's a lot of information out there, but you want to make sure that you deal in facts and not fear. Let your personal biases go aside, research and do your research and understand the facts as they apply to your organization, to the vaccines. You really need to decide and evaluate and document if there's a business necessity for you to require your employees to return to the office, or whether you require your employees to be vaccinated. You also want to consider about any moves you take and how they impact your employees versus what you think is right and how they feel you're being treated. And whether or not you mandate or encourage, decide the approach. Are you going to pay for it up front, reimburse them? Are you going to provide incentives? And what type of incentives are you going to provide in making sure that you evaluate the impact those incentives can have on your employees and on your operations? And again, whatever approach you have and take, make sure that supports your position on your EEO policy, your ADA, and your age discrimination policies. And don't forget, this is key. Not only we talked about educating your employees, but educate your managers and supervisors, especially when it comes to the interactive process they need to be aware of. And lastly, don't go it alone. You want to look at how you evaluate your policy, how it impacts the organization, and you want to review it with a partner. There's enough of us out there that can support you if you have questions and be sounding boards to help you figure out what is right for your organization and also for your employees. Now, here's some of the links that I talked about. I know Jennifer mentioned a little earlier, we'll be distributing a copy of today's presentation, and that'll include these links that you can go to sort of access additional information about the resources and the information I've referenced today. And again, please feel free afterwards to reach out to me if I can be any further assistance. And I just hope that this webinar today is maybe giving you enough to start thinking about if you're going to encourage or mandate a vaccination policy for your organization. What are the things that could impact that decision? How could it affect your organization? So again, Jennifer, that sort of concludes the presentation information I want to present. I'm happy to open it up to, and again, let me just share with you, certainly my contact information will be available, so should you need to reach out. But right now, I'll stop sharing my screen, and Jennifer, if there's questions or anything we need to start talking about, let me know.
Well, we do have a question that was a perfect segue to how you were wrapping up your discourse, and that is, what if you do not mandate vaccines and someone in the office gets COVID that is traced back to another employee? What are the implications there?
Well, there are some rules, and again, we didn't really talk about OSHA here, but OSHA sort of gives you some guidelines. You have to do an investigation to determine, is that a work-related COVID-19 scenario? So is it an incident of where they got it, it was work-related? And so what they're going to look at are things like how many people are getting, came down with the virus at work. So is it work-related at that point, or potentially did they get it elsewhere? But if the individual and through contact tracing comes back to, yes, their only exposure was here at work, it's probably going to be a workers' comp claim that you're going to have to report to your carrier. I don't know if that helps. I hope that helps, but there's steps, and OSHA has steps out there that you can follow to determine that.
That's a helpful thing to know too. Is there a reference that we can go to? All right, let's put a little bit different spin on the question. You had mentioned taking employee surveys. All right, if you survey your employees, are there any implications for HIPAA compliance given that we're polling employees about a health-related issue?
Well, I think, again, when you look at surveying your employees, we're not trying to solicit any health-related information from them. Where, think about, do they have concerns? You're not really asking them to disclose anything. Number one, also, is the survey going to be anonymous? So we're not getting exposure to identify the individual. And I would encourage you not to identify individuals' responses. But it all depends on how I think the survey is going to be worded and rolled out. So I would avoid any questions that may solicit very specific work-related, health-related, and privacy issues.
Okay, can we ask if people are taking the vaccine? So wondering if this relates to coverage for, when you're getting out to get a shot, and planning for coverage of staff if they're ill after the shot. It's about covering their work when they are away. So can we ask if people are taking the vaccine so we can get adequate coverage in place? Well,
if I understand the question correctly, can we ask them if they're going to if they're going to take the vaccine? So, yeah. Not that they have it.
Pardon me, I was going to read it to you verbatim to make sure that my interpretation isn't. Here's the question. Can we ask if staff are taking the vaccine? This is relating to getting coverage for when they're away.
Okay, so in other words, I want to go take the vaccine. I'm gonna be off work this morning because I'm going to seek the vaccine. Again, that's going to come back to a policy issue as to why, I have PTO. Am I required to take my PTO? Or as an employer, am I encouraging you and will give you the time off to go get your vaccination? So again, that's not soliciting, just the fact that I'm going to the doctor, just like anything else. We're not soliciting, do you have a health issue or whatever? I have a doctor's appointment, or I have an appointment to go do this. We're going to let you take PTO, or we're just going to pay you time and not charge it against your PTO. What are we doing to do that? So it's no different. If you're going to go request the time off, we have to have coverage. It's like I would apply your same policy for time off. How do you request it?
What if they don't have time off stored up and they need to go during business hours? How would you recommend handling this? They don't have, I get what you're saying. If they have PTO, awesome sauce, they just go through the same process. We don't ask people what they're doing on PTO, but what if they don't have any, then what?
Well, again, that's really going to go back to, bear with me one second. Jennifer, can you speak again?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out, I'm having trouble hearing you, the volume for some reason or other, but it's on my end, I'm sure. So if they don't have time off, again, that's going to be back to a policy issue. How do you handle it? If you're going to do something for one, what about the other? So in looking at that, if they don't have time off, do you allow unpaid time? Do you allow them to take the time off to go do it? again, if it's a mandate, you're going to need to pay them for that time. But if it's an encouragement or just supporting them, you need to make sure you would treat this situation the same you would any other situation. If they had to go take, and again, we're talking about non-exempt hourly paid employees here, by the way, just so that we know. As an exempt employee, you're not going to be docking people hours for situations like this.
Can we ask someone specifically, do you plan to get the shot?
I think that probably comes out to when we're talking about the survey. I would caution you to be selective about who you are asking that question to. It should be asked of everybody, not just, I don't want to just go to the employees that I know are 65 and older and say, hey, have you went and got your shot yet? Or when are you planning to get your shot? Or anybody else I know that might have extenuating health situations. You got to be careful about how you ask those questions, because it could be potentially that's being discriminatory. Oh, I didn't hear you at all.
Sorry, I muted myself. My husband had a sneezing attack. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, so now can we ask employees to give us documentation of having been vaccinated? Like, do we have to have proof that they were vaccinated?
Technically, guess what the answer is? Technically, yes, but. No, I say that there's a lot of information out there right now, especially from the EEOC, that has basically said you can ask them for validation that they've received the vaccine, but what you do not want to do is solicit any of the information behind that. Why did you have to get the vaccine? Was there an underlying health condition? You don't want anything to do with the questionnaire they're going to have to complete to get the vaccine, but simply saying, have you been vaccinated? Yes, no. You're allowed to ask that and say, okay, just validate for me that you've had the vaccine. And think about whether you want something specific in writing, just think that through. But yes, you can ask for validation that they've been vaccinated. But again, consistently going forward.
Okay, here's another interesting twist on this. If we incentivize staff to get the vaccine, but we know there are some among us who will elect not to due to whatever, perhaps religious beliefs or whatever, they're going to opt out. Do we have to offer them the same kind of incentives that are offered to people that perhaps wouldn't have personal barriers to going to get that vaccine?
This is going to be no different than your reasonable accommodation for things like your wellness initiatives that companies have. If somebody has a valid reason, whether it be medically related because of the ADA, they're a disability of some sort, health-related reason they cannot take the vaccine, or it's a religious reason, you need to make sure you've thought through what are your reasonable alternatives and accommodations that you can make for those individuals. I don't know what the answer to that would be, other than to say you need to evaluate what would be right for your organization. What do they need to do in order to validate? And again, remember, they can say no for anything related to health-related reasons that might make them compromised, and also for any religious reasons. And remember, it's not your everyday type of religion. It can be for any religion that prohibits their belief that, vaccines are not appropriate. So you just have to decide how you're going to handle those exceptions.
All right. I think it was helpful, the first thing you said about, hey, this kind of falls under reasonable accommodations.
Yep.
That frames it up nicely.
Okay.
So here's sort of a broader question.
All right.
Are you a person that can help us develop specific policies and practices around what we implement?
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's a collaborative effort also, because it's going to depend on your particular organization, but we can look at how do we draft that? How do we look at what the potential exposures, the hurdles are that we're going to deal with? But yes, something that I'm available to assist clients with.
Excellent. Excellent.
Doing a lot of that with some current clients now anyway. So yes, because I would also, let me go back to say, and I'm working with a client that, California requires you to have your policies and procedures documented as they relate to COVID-19 in the workplace. So very specific steps. And one of the things we're working on is rolling that out. They have locations across the country, so we have to expand that beyond California, but it's required there. So I don't know where most of our participants today on the webinar today have employees located, but you know, we were going to want to look at that. We want to look at what do you have in place that is your protocol as to how you're going to administer, you know, COVID-19 protocol within the workplace. So yes, bottom line, yes, I can help.
Got it. Well, you know, this is such a rabbit hole right now because of the unknowns. We just don't know. And of course, the rapidly changing information. So it's a bit of a relief to know that we have folks who are staying on the forefront of this issue to help guide us. So, you know, folks like you, it's like, you know, we're very grateful that you've got your eye on this and can help us navigate these processes.
My pleasure.
All right, well, guys, I'm not seeing any other questions come through Q&A or in the chat. So I'm going to take just one final opportunity to keep the floor open. If there's anything that you would like for us to touch on that we have not done so already, then what we'll do is go ahead and bring our sessions to a close. I try not to ever get between people and their lunches. And anytime we can adjourn a few minutes early, I consider it kind of a gift, right? And I hope you guys feel the same. But know that, you know, we're here, Aparo is here to reach out if you need any questions or guidance relative to resources that we can bring to bear. We're certainly available to help you. And as Keith has mentioned, he's available to help you. If you need guidance on, you know, helping draft your policies, figure out what your practices are, what is the way forward in this issue. You know, Keith has just mentioned that he can make himself available. So you will have his contact details and you can certainly connect with him on this subject if you need to do so. Keith, thank you so much again for your time and your expertise and your guidance on these issues. As I say, it's a deep well, and we very much appreciate your willingness to share your time and expertise.
Well, anytime. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Aparo, and thank you for those who attended today, the opportunity to share this information. And I look forward to, you know, hopefully being of some help and support to others out there. So feel free to reach out.
I sure do appreciate it. Guys, we'll send the deck along with a copy or a link rather to this recording if you want to listen in again to what we have discussed. And with that, I'm going to thank everyone. Actually, before I let you go, Keith, I just have one more question come in. If you have client-facing employees, are there legal implications for not mandating on the vaccine?
Wow, that's a question I might defer to your attorney, I would say, because we're talking about liability issues. There are steps that you have to take. If you have an employee that is client-facing that tests positive and is exposing others, there's certain contact tracing steps you have to follow and notifying the Department of Health and others. So there's things that as an employer you have to do if you have an employee that tests positive and is exposing others out there. So that's a sticky question, but I would certainly make sure you have in place exactly what the employee is supposed to do if they test positive and notifying you so you can minimize. Now, I do want to close on this one other thing. North Carolina also passed, and I'm talking North Carolina here, I believe also the governor put into place some type of requirement or opportunity for you to minimize your liability in the workplace if you post specific steps you are taking as somebody comes into your place of employment. What are the steps that are in place to protect employees? And you're doing those things. You know, so there's some additional information out there. I'm not articulating exactly word for word, but you have to post what steps you're taking in order to minimize the potential exposure or risk of COVID-19 in this facility. And that way can help minimize your potential liability and exposure. So with that, I'll end, but thank you again.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much. We sure do appreciate it. Guys, thank you for attending. Hope you found this valuable. Be sure and give us feedback if you have any. And if you want to know more about this subject, you want us to revisit it, let us know. And we'll see about rescheduling as time moves along and new information becomes available. Otherwise, thanks to everybody. We appreciate your time and attention. Keith, thanks again. We'll be in touch soon. And everybody have a great rest of the day before another 4 days of rain. So
All right. Goodbye now. Bye.
bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.